Now this is the plan. Get your ass to Mars. Get your ass to Mars.
Get your ass to Mars.
Armored Core 2 dropped in the year 2000 in Japan and North America, and in 2001 in PAL regions for the PlayStation 2. In North America, this made it one of 29 launch titles for the system. From Software had two other titles also available at launch, Eternal Ring and Evergrace. AC2 maintains continuity from the PS1 titles to some extent, but it is largely separated from the stories and settings of those games. It takes place several decades later on Mars. This setting is showcased to some extent within certain stages, but I frequently felt we may as well have been on Earth anyway, considering the geography of some of the outdoor missions. This is explained by the terraforming done by one of the corporations in the game, Zeo Matrix. Returning to the formula of the first game, we play as a mercenary, a Raven, who has recently arrived on Mars in order to take jobs from the various corporations and governments vying for power on the Red Planet. The mission briefings now have voice acting, most of which is pretty memorable. My favorites were definitely Emerald.
The target is the Rectenna installation in the Hellas Plain.
And LCC.
Target is an employee of ours who has been selling highly classified information.
There is an increased amount of voice acting in general, no doubt thanks to the increased storage capacity of the DVD format used for this and most other PS2 games. I'm happy to report that the voice acting is now at a reasonable volume level compared to the PS1 titles. AC2 has a pretty solid storyline, definitely the most developed out of any of the games yet. In addition to the corporate warfare element, a clear-cut antagonist arises, and the way the plot thread gradually develops is decently effective. Continuing from the increased usage of cutscenes seen in Project Phantasma and Master of Arena, the storyline gets a chance to develop within missions and in in-game cutscenes, which gracefully ramp up towards the endgame. There are some twists and turns along the way. One interesting notable element is the ancient Martian technology of unmanned disorder units and how they are incorporated into the storyline. Certain missions, like the original game, will be a game over if you fail. I guess that your pilot is actually getting killed in these situations, versus just the AC being destroyed. Armored Core 2 kind of has the opposite problem from AC1 in that some of the earlier missions are a bit uninspired and tedious, but the missions improve massively from about the 1/3 mark in, culminating in an enjoyable campaign that ramped up in a satisfying way, featuring a wide variety of settings and objectives. As mentioned earlier, the formula for AC2 remained extremely similar to the PS1 titles, but there have been some notable additions and changes. One nice quality of life element is multiple storage slots for builds within a single save file, allowing you to easily switch between multiple AC loadouts. This is displayed a bit strangely, as you see the parts visibly load in and out in real time, but it's a welcome feature. It's basically the same control scheme as before, with a few additions. Despite being on PlayStation 2, we still unfortunately have no analog stick support. One very nice improvement though is that the game is now running at 60 frames per second, nearly 3 times higher than the PS1 trilogy's 22 frames per second. The ACs in this one move slower and overall feel clunkier to control than the PlayStation 1 titles. They also seem to fall faster, which is odd considering that the surface gravity on Mars is only about 38% of what it is on Earth. So unless Zeo Matrix's terraforming project included somehow multiplying the mass of the planet several times over, this doesn't make much sense. But obviously this is a gameplay thing over realism. But it could have been interesting seeing AC is capable of doing massive jumps thanks to the lower gravity. I do think the handling overall is a downgrade from the PlayStation 1 generation. The movement feels less fluid and air mobility has taken a hit. One movement option that does feel great with the lighter ACs is bunny hopping. Strafe with L1 or R1 and keep double tapping X. This will move you at a much higher speed than just regular circle strafing, and if your timing is on point, will also allow your energy to regenerate while you still can move at high speeds. Another new mechanic is the limiter release, found exclusively in AC2 and Another Age. In AC2, hold both L2 and R2 and press R3. In another age, you also need to hold L1 and R1 as well. This gives your AC infinite energy for a limited time determined by your core part's limit value. This is balanced by you being completely drained of energy for at least twice as long afterwards. This basically means the limited release is a last resort type maneuver, because if you're in a combat situation and you don't end that combat before this runs out, you're most likely toast. Shields are another new option added for your AC's left arm. They're pretty passive, you just hit circle and your AC will activate it. Damage is reduced and energy is consumed while active. It's not quite as exciting as the intro cutscene makes it out to be. Perhaps to compensate for the slower overall speed of the game, the overboost mechanic has been added. Hit R3 and after a short startup sequence your AC will gain a massive burst of speed. This consumes a lot of energy too, of course, but it's useful for covering a lot of ground quickly, as well as a nice tool to have in combat. Another addition, and one that I wasn't a big fan of, is the overheating mechanic. Your AC now has a temperature meter and a new part category to help manage it: radiators. Heat primarily builds up by taking hits from certain types of weaponry. If you overheat, it essentially acts like poison, with your armor points, basically your health in these games, slowly draining until you cool down. While this is happening, you're also punished with an annoying sound effect until it wears off. The arena mode is essentially the same as it was in Master of Arena, with lots of distinct opponents to challenge as you work your way up the ladder, including some subtle and not so subtle references to the prior games. There's also still a range of serious and not so serious ACs, my favorite being this guy who's so obsessed with the number 1 that he's happy to stay ranked in 11th place, because, you know, 2 1s are better than 1, right? Another returning element from that game is that you'll sometimes go up against other arena ranked ACs while you're doing your missions, which, if they're killed in them, they're then removed from the arena rankings. One new element to the arena is that new challengers are sometimes added as you progress through the campaign. Most of these are pushovers, but the final newcomer is Matthias, a brutally difficult challenge. He, like the others at the top of the ladder, are again utilizing Human Plus. Yes, that mechanic is back for AC2, and it again requires going into deep debt multiple times in order to fully utilize it. The AI in the arena seems less intelligent than the previous games. It's easier than ever for enemy ACs to get stuck behind objects and walls. It's useful for cheesing certain tough opponents, but I think the arena mode is overall less satisfying to conquer when you can breeze through so many of the ACs without even trying to exploit the AI at all. Quite a few of the early ACs will basically sit there and let you wail on them. This means a way to easily get a leg up in a new Armored Core 2 save is to immediately head to the arena, take out the first 10 or so opponents, and then use the rewarded credits to buy some much better gear. One unfortunate aspect of the arena is that it still auto-loads replays upon victory, meaning that you must again sit through multiple loading screens before you're able to move on. Multiplayer returns as you would expect, featuring both split screen and system link. I do think the selection of stages on offer here is a downgrade from Master of Arena, which had a great collection of stages both in terms of layout and visuals, but it's still fun to put you and a friend's AC head-to-head as always. Graphical flourishes have been added, like left arm weapons now actually being visible, and additional animation for certain weapon types. Model and texture complexity of course receive an upgrade with the power of the PlayStation 2, but I found that the visuals weren't always necessarily a total upgrade from the PlayStation 1 games. Lighting in general sometimes seems less dynamic, both in terms of the technology as well as the art direction. You don't see many scenes with pulsing lights or changing colors like you sometimes saw in the earlier titles. Some projectiles and explosions are drawn via low geometry polygons instead of sticking entirely to sprites and vertex lighting. Additionally, brightness levels applied to said vertex lighting does seem less dynamic, giving the game an overall flatter look in that regard. This is a really minor detail, but I was sad to see that stepping on the cars of Mars no longer makes them explode like they would in the previous AC games. Fortunately, in its place, we do get the very satisfying addition of some destructible buildings. This isn't always possible with the larger skyscrapers and whatnot, but exploding housing blocks and other relatively smaller architecture is really satisfying and can change the dynamics of a combat encounter. One new addition are weather effects like snow and a blinding sandstorm. There is usually a lack of fog in the large outdoor areas, and flat textures in the distance that sometimes overall looks worse than the PS1 titles. This is sometimes made worse by occasional empty and low detail skyboxes. The PS1 titles would sometimes utilize that classic fade into darkness effect you'd see on the system sometimes that helped manage the draw distance for the console's limited resources. This effect sometimes compromised gameplay. I found that it usually gave the scenes it was utilized in a greater sense of depth and overall visual contrast. That being said, they did a really great job with the character models and the texture work here. The ACs in the other mecha look better than ever, and the texture work is far more dynamic than it had been prior to this point. Detail is high, and you can see from this footage that the game overall upscales extremely well in emulators. AC2 has a very smooth visual style which works well in conjunction with the stylish heads-up display and the amount of information on screen. The soundtrack is another winner, again featuring Kichiro Sagawa and Kota Hishino, as well as Tsukasa Saito, Yuji Kanda, and Ikuya Ichinohe. A few tracks were also contributed by Mishk van Dijk, a German producer and DJ. I'd love to know how he got involved in this project. Like the PS1 games, it's a high energy and totally electronic collection of tracks. While some tracks maintain the acid techno feel from the older games, others are noticeably approaching a level of abstraction not commonly heard in video games. Check out this track, Joy Ball. This one's by Hoshino. Wild, right? Most of the tracks aren't nearly that out there though, and feature pretty straightforward style breakbeat and techno elements. Again, a high quality OST and another winner in this regard. That about covers it for Armored Core 2. It's another quality title that I would recommend, but again with the caveat that you may need to adapt to old school shooter controls if you're not like me and that skill didn't calcify in your developing brain back in the 90s. It's extremely similar to the PS1 titles, so if you've already played those, you'll know what to expect. AC2 Another Age was released a year later in 2001 and takes the setting back to planet Earth. There isn't really any kind of storyline to speak of. Another Age is basically a mission pack. 100 missions without any plot arcs, just you as a mercenary doing gigs and getting paid. Some of these involve the Earth branches of the corporations we last encountered on Mars in AC2, but you don't really change the power structures here or make any kind of major changes in the world. One major omission is the arena mode. This had become a pretty significant staple of the series by this point, so it's odd to see it missing. Another element removed from this one are the emails. Given their overall contribution to the world of the game and the immersion factor as a result, this feels like a major mistake, especially since we're back on Earth in this continuity for the first time in over 60 years. This is the final game in the original series storyline continuity. Nothing is really done to recognize or warrant that. References are made to the Great Destruction and certain older events and groups here and there, but overall this title has very little going for it in either storyline, lore, or immersiveness as a result. The mission layout is now different. Instead of a single list, you have different regions that have multiple missions. More regions gradually unlock as you complete assignments. Complete all the missions in a region and you usually unlock a part. Other than that, it's what you'd expect. Pick a mission, get a briefing, do it, hopefully make a profit, upgrade, repeat. The missions themselves are a real mixed bag, and I'm sorry to report that many of them felt like pretty glaring examples of quantity over quality. Gray, featureless mazes are a bit of an AC series staple at this point, but there are an unusual amount of them in Another Age. Sometimes you even have to do these same missions twice. The second time will have a different goal and some different enemies, but the experience is almost exactly the same. There have been times before in the series up until this point where maps were reused, but not the mazes, and certainly not as frequently as in this game. The most tedious example of this kind of game design is probably the mission where, between destroying enemies, you're riding elevators up through a parking garage, and then back down it, and then all the way back up to the 30th floor. The final elevator ride here takes so long that I discovered that the player AC actually has an idle animation. You occasionally go up against enemy ACs as you would expect, and most of them are pretty hardcore here, featuring tricked out human plus builds and even some 1-on-3 encounters. There are also a handful of unique large boss encounters, but these are all pretty basic and frankly feel pretty lazy. They are almost all entirely inanimate and require no different tactics than any other fight in the game. Check out this big bug boss rotating with zero animation. In fact, I think the only time it really animates at all is in its death animation. There's a similar experience with a huge MT fight. It's a cool concept, but it may as well be any other encounter because there's nothing mechanically differentiating it against any other fight. The only unique encounters to be found in the game are the secret 3 that can be fought against after you 100% the rest of the game, and even then, they're just rematches from enemies from the previous titles. Overall, the game is definitely quite a bit harder than AC2, and I would encourage you to definitely import your save from that one. I haven't utilized Human Plus yet in any of these games so far, but this was the first one where I wished I had. Some missions seriously push the mechanics to edge, usually involving energy consumption, which is at far more of a premium than it was in the PS1 titles. There are several devious jumping puzzles in some of these missions, tedious exercises which are a continuous string of almost requiring a build dedicated to covering as much airtime as possible. Overall, they felt quite a bit less polished and more trial and error heavy than the previous games. One bit of mercy shown in this title, possibly as a result of the aforementioned mission design, is that there are no expenses on mission failure. The missions aren't all bad, and there are definitely some good ones in here, of both the traditional variety as well as a handful that tries something new. Notable ones for me were the stealth mission in a city, requiring you to sneak around and covertly eliminate targets, the bomb defusal missions, and this one where you have to pursue and destroy a moving train. Little moments of novelty go a long way in this game, especially given the sheer quantity of missions here. You can now use the left analog stick to move, but this is implemented in the most basic way possible. It's basically functioning exactly the same as the D-pad, with no additional granularity in either movement or turning speed. It's just as binary as the D-pad. It actually feels worse than that because you have this wide range of possible input on the analog stick that makes no difference until you hit the 4 poles, which just feels awkward and clumsy. Another strange design choice is the shop menus where the items now loop with no indication of having done so. Given the technical nature of the naming scheme, this makes the menus significantly less clear in terms of navigation. Graphically, the game is almost exactly the same as AC2 with some slight refinements. There is a new glossy sheen texture effect on the ACs. This is a minor thing, but stepping on cars again makes them explode, but over boosting into and over them does not. The smaller, destructible buildings from AC2 are also gone. If you like smashing boxes and crates, however, this game has you covered. One truly bottom-of-the-barrel mission here has you looking for an objective hidden within one of about 100 of them. As mentioned earlier, there is no arena, but there are a few missions that are basically like exhibition matches between you as an Earth AC versus a Mars AC, which also feature the music from AC2. However, unlike any of the other arena matches in the previous games, you're forced to pay for all expenses afterwards. The game's soundtrack is the same style as AC2, but it wasn't as memorable for me. It's not a bad OST by any means, but it did feel less melodically inspired and energetic for me. The voice acting overall was also not as memorable, other than this guy.
Let's get out of here while we can.
The multiplayer is still here, fortunately, now with some missions that you can undertake with a friend. But these all feel pretty half-baked, and you'll probably find yourself switching back to normal versus modes after checking them out. One really odd omission is that you can't change camera angles in the multiplayer replays. I have no idea why this would be removed. It was really cool seeing the match from your opponents or from a more dramatic perspective after the match, especially when you had those great climactic moments or finishers. If it wasn't already glaringly obvious, I was not crazy about Another Age. Overall, I felt it was kind of a slog, and the first game in the series that I'm not sure I would recommend, unless you are in extreme need of more missions with the AC2 mechanics. And given that those mechanics are not as tight or as smooth as they were in AC1 to begin with, plus the loss of any kind of storyline, arena mode, and a general lack of polish in the mission design, means that Another Age is not a game I see myself returning to, personally. All footage you've seen in this video was recorded via the PS2 emulator PCSX2, and I would recommend playing either of these games through it. Both upscale beautifully, they work fine with the widescreen hacks, and generally run close to perfect. There are a couple of effects here and there that are broken, but given the option, I think it's definitely the way to go, if possible. Both also work fine with OPL if you want to play on real hardware. And like last time, please do not give your money to scalpers on eBay. That about covers it for the second generation of Armored Core. Next time we will begin looking at the third generation, which is comprised of a staggering 6 titles. Coverage of this generation will get split into 2 parts as a result, so watch out for part 3 in this video series featuring what a lot of fans consider to be highlights among the games, Armored Core 3 and Silent Line. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.
What is it that you wish?
Give this people air!